Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to another edition of the Sulaimaan Ravat Show. You know, ever so often we speak about the very first revelation that came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the cave of Hira. It was when Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was at the age of 40, and it was after approximately 6 centuries from the time of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, Jesus, peace be upon him, the prophet that came before the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And after 6 centuries, right, 600 years, such a long gap, number one. Number two, Arabia had reached the lowest ebb that humanity has ever reached. Sheikh Abul Hasan Ali Nadwi, rahimahullah, has written that if you study the history of humanity, never has mankind reached a low ebb like the pagan Arabs had reached during that period which we refer to as the Jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic period, the period of ignorance. It's referred to as Jahiliyyah because ignorance had become prevalent. People used to bury their own daughters alive. They used to circumambulate and make tawaf of the Kaaba naked. They used to fight feudal and tribal wars for years on end, without any real reason, just because of ego and just because of small petty issues. And here the Prophet ﷺ is now being sent as a prophet after 600 years. He's being sent to a nation that had reached the lowest ebb that humanity had ever seen, a nation with regards whom even the superpowers of the time, the Romans and the Persians, did not want to rule. And he was being sent as the final prophet. There was no prophet to come after him. وَخَاتَمَ النَّبِيِّينَ. He is the seal of the prophets. And then, after considering all of these things, what is the first instruction? Does Allah say, do not bury your daughters alive? Does Allah say, do not fornicate? Does Allah say, do not take your mothers as inheritance after the demise of your fathers? This was something that the Arabs used to do. None of that. Allah says, iqra, read, recite, educate yourself. Because when you educate yourself, that is when transformation will take place. The other day I was explaining at an adult class, and I said, we all know, and it is a unanimous fact, that the greatest bounty, the greatest boon, the greatest gift, the greatest favor which Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has conferred upon us is that of Iman. It's that of faith. But have you ever wondered that after Iman, after faith, which is the second greatest bounty which Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has conferred upon us, it is that of ilm. It is that of knowledge. Why? Because you require knowledge to be able to recognize Allah. You require knowledge to be able to recognize what is right and what is wrong. You require knowledge to be able to know what is pleasing and what is displeasing to Allah. You require knowledge to be able to know what is the purpose of your existence. You require knowledge to be able to chart your way forward to prepare for the everlasting life of the after. You require knowledge to be able to preserve your faith. So whilst faith is the greatest bounty which Allah has conferred upon us, without us making an effort, without us being deserving of it, then too, to preserve your faith. Having faith is one thing, having Iman is one thing, but to preserve your Iman, you require knowledge. And then as Imam Bukhari rahimahullah educates us, Al-Imanu yazidu wa yanqus. Iman increases and Iman decreases depending on your actions. So you require knowledge to be able to inform your actions. And your actions will then strengthen or either strengthen or weaken your Iman and faith. So, whilst Iman is the greatest bounty, to preserve your Iman, you require knowledge. Knowledge, broadly speaking, is of two types. One is what we call revealed knowledge, the Quran, directly revealed from the heavens by Allah via the Archangel Gabriel, to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam over a period of 23 years. That's one thing. The other thing is that revealed but not direct. That's wahi ghayr matlu, as they say in Arabic terminology, where it was not the words of Allah, the spoken words of Allah as the Quran is, but it was what Allah has inspired to the Prophet ﷺ directly, and he as the appointed messenger has taught us. So what we find in the ahadith, what we find in the sunnah, that is part of revealed knowledge. Quran, sunnah, sharia, that is what we talk about when we refer to revealed knowledge. And non-revealed knowledge is the sciences of this world, which at times can be beneficial, at times not really beneficial, but it has its place because it enables you to function in this world. And this world is where we need to maximize and optimize in order to be able to invest in the everlasting life of the hereafter. This world, in that context, has a great value. This world, in that, from that perspective, is pivotal to us because life is a great gift from Allah. In order to live your life, to be independent of others, in order to be able to fulfill your role as a human, you need to be at the forefront of multiple fields. And when we see Islamic civilization at its height, then Muslims were the forerunners in science and in maths and in medicine and everything else. So worldly sciences that have benefit is definitely something that we are interested in. And that is where education comes into the play, even if it be education from a so-called secular perspective. Knowledge which is of no benefit, that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam sought protection from. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min ilmin la yanfa'. But knowledge which has benefit, even though it's not revealed, it's of critical importance. Of course, revealed knowledge has its superiority because it gives perspective to the non-revealed knowledge and it enables you and guides you in terms of how you use your revealed knowledge. Right, with that backdrop, we take our first break. When we come back, we speak to well-known personality in education, Mary Metcalfe. Right, so now we welcome to the program Mary Metcalfe. Mary is well known in the field of education, has been involved since 1974 as a teacher, as a principal, as a lecturer, served as MEC for education in the Gauteng province as well as, and I think in a general sense you can say, is a specialist when it comes to education. Mary, we thank you for your time, really appreciate it. Welcome to the Sulaimaan Ravat Show.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's start with the issue that is hot off the press, if I can put it that way, the matric results. What's your assessment of the matric results, all things considered, coming on the back of a year where the pandemic pretty much brought the world to its knees?
I think two things. First of all, the results are credible. Umalosi exists to quality assure the results and to ensure that the matric results of 1 year can be equivalent to other years, which means that learners who wrote this year need to know that their achievement has the same value and the same currency as any other year. When I say they're credible, to have a major increase in matric results in a year of a pandemic would not be credible. What we've seen instead is an overall decline of about 5%, which is a disappointment, but it certainly could have been much worse. The performance across different provinces varies. Some provinces dropped slightly, and some provinces dropped by about 10%. So for many learners, this is a disappointment. They need to know that firstly, it's not necessarily their fault. They were working at a very difficult time, and they may not have got the results that they would have liked. But we also, as a country, need to be expressing a huge sense of gratitude and appreciation for the work of teachers who carried the brunt of teaching and ensuring learning under COVID.
There are those who make a very generalized statement and they say that the matriculants of 2020 had a bit of an easy ride because of the COVID-related challenges, and definitely there were physical challenges for them, having to do Zoom classes and that kind of thing, that the examination papers were intentionally made somewhat easy. Is that in any way factual?
It's absolutely untrue. Umalosi, as the quality assurer of the DBE's National Senior Certificate, took a firm position that the results of 2020 have to have the same currency as any other year. They did not have an easy ride. And you may have seen me smile when you said, well, they had to use Zoom. That was a very small percentage. The majority of learners, I would say 90% of learners in public school, do not have access to devices, do not have access to data, do not have access to reliable Wi-Fi. not only was it difficult to study, but they were studying under the conditions of uncertainty, anxiety, and living with family members, community members that were ill, and many may have lost family members. So the class of 2020 did not have an easy ride.
Yes. In a way, did they pick up certain skills as a result of the challenges that they had to deal with that puts them in a better position to deal with the challenges of the real world once they move from matric to tertiary education, and from there, into the mainstream of society? As much as it was a huge setback, the dynamics that the pandemic brought to the fore, were there some unintended benefits, if we can put it that way?
It's always good to look at the positive impacts. I think for learners who were able to learn at home and did have the resources and even the physical space to do so, yes, they would have learned, I think, to work more independently. They had the months of lockdown where they weren't able to be at school, and many learners really took the initiative and learned successfully at home until they were back at school. Many of them were supported by teachers. So that, again, was a minority. For many grade 12 learners, the lockdown period before they returned to school, they were pretty much on their own. And it's a tribute to them that they were able to somehow persevere using their textbooks and in whatever other way they were able to access support. The DBE and the NECT put into place a program called Waza Matrix for the 10 weeks before the exams as a catch-up process, which learners were able to access on SABC TV and other TV platforms. And that also required planning. It required them to be able to set time aside, work independently. So yes, there are always learnings.
Has it become clear how many matriculants, or rather how many matric students for the year 2020 actually did not make it to the end? They did not get to sit and actually write the exams as a result of the conditions that resulted from the pandemic. We know that nutrition is a big thing in public schools in terms of kids being given the meal for the day, etc. Transport also is a big factor, and for those who live in the rural areas and in those areas that are not as developed as your cities, it was not all that easy to adjust and to improvise and to continue and complete the matric year.
Okay, so that's an interesting question, and I'm going to take it in two parts. I'm going to look at the grade 12s of 2020, the NSC cohort. Now, we know that about 578,000 learners wrote, and of that, about 444,000 passed. That means that there were about 138,000 who didn't pass. And that's a major setback, and it's as a percentage more than in previous years. But every year there are learners who register and don't write for a variety of reasons.
All right, let's take a quick break, and we come back, we try and continue the discussion with Mary Metcalfe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to another edition of the Sulaimaan Ravat Show. So yeah, February is that time of the year. On the political scene, you have the State of the Nation address towards the initial part of February, and then is followed about 2 weeks later by the budget speech delivered by the Finance Minister. This time around, once again, it's Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. He delivered his speech on Wednesday afternoon. And since then, there's been analysis, unpacking, compliments, criticism, speculation, and a lot of discussion. Whether you support one party or another, whether you vote for one party or the other, the budget speech has relevance to everyone. It has implications for everyone. So we are going to get some expert analysis, and we're going to unpack some of the key issues this evening with ASRI's Angelo Fick. Angelo, as always, we really appreciate your time. A very good evening and welcome once again to the Sulaimaan Ravat Show on ITV Networks. Angelo, can you hear me? Okay, we're going to try and get Angelo back on the line and see how that plays out, because we just had him and it seems like we've lost him. He's the Director of Programs at ASRI, Oval Socio-Economic Research Institute, ASRI. It was launched a couple of years ago. I remember when we had the launch event. It was at the Wanderers Club. Then Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa was the guest of honor. And all Muslim media were there, the radio stations, ITV. The next day we had panel discussions. I chaired the one with Praveen Gordon and Floyd Shivambu and the then Deputy Public Protector on the topic of corruption. Fond memories, and ASRI has come a long way since then. And we speak regularly to the experts, whether it be Mohammed Kaji, the Executive Director, or Angelo Fick, who's the Head of Programs, or even Ibrahim Fakir. Angelo actually is the Head of Research, I think, yeah. And Ibrahim is the Head of Programs. And they are renowned and well-known analysts. They make a number of appearances on other mainstream media as well. So I'm just waiting for an indication that as soon as Angelo's with us, then we can commence the discussion. Many, sighed with relief when when Minister Mboweni did not directly increase taxes. Others were not too happy about other aspects. The fuel levy is an ongoing concern every year. They just pile it on and pile it on. It's one of the easiest ways of generating revenue. Earlier in this week, I had an opportunity also of interviewing SARS Commissioner Kisweta, Edward Kisweta. Their revenue is down, and they're also looking at an opportunity. They also understand that there cannot be a direct increase in taxes. You need to allow the economy to recover for the long-term prospects. All right, I'm hoping that in the next minute or two we can get Angelo Fick back on the line with us. Otherwise, we would take a quick break, and hopefully after the break have him with us on the line. All right, we've got Angelo back on the line. Let's hope it holds this time. Angelo, a very good evening to you. Always a pleasure to speak to you on the Sulaimaan Ravat Show. Welcome.
Good evening, Salam to you and to viewers.
Let me start with the broad question. Overall, what were your thoughts on the budget speech? Anything that particularly interested you, disappointed you, caught you by surprise?
I think overall there is a sense of disappointment at the conservatism and the holding of the line by the Treasury on issues that we know have failed, strategies that haven't worked in the past. The same promises that there will be infrastructure spend and that we should all wait until 2024, 2025 until things might become right again. There's nothing about the major cuts that we need to have in the most senior levels of the executive, and that's across all three tiers of government, or in any kind of even symbolic gesture that members of parliament are going to be asked to cut their income. And so when there's talk of government not overspending despite not having the cash reserves that the minister indicates in his speech, there seems to be not even a symbolic gesture that there will be a leaner and trimmer government. There will only be a leaner and trimmer, somehow, public service at which the ordinary people will end up having to pay the price for, government having to curtail its spending.
Let's just take a step back or a step to the side, if you like. One issue that seems to be recurring, and it came up for discussion in analysis interviews during the course of the week on radio platforms as well, is how much of discretion does the finance minister have? If you look at the issue of a leaner or trimmer cabinet, for example, is that out of his hands? Is that the prerogative of the president and the executive? Does he have to work within a very tight framework, the policies of the ruling party, and then decisions of the cabinet and decisions of the president? Is he kind of like very narrowed in what he really can do and what he can't?
So the budget speech, while it's delivered by the Minister of Finance, is actually a document that consults all of the other role players, including people in the executive, the cabinet, the president himself, along with other players in the, shall we say, larger social compact in which the governing party governs the Republic of South Africa. And so while Tito Mboweni reads out the speech, he will certainly have consulted, as he acknowledges in his speech, various stakeholders, including NEDLAC, the trades unions, the alliance partners in the tripartite alliance. And so this is really a larger document by the governing elite of South Africa. And in that sense, it is really disappointing, because the ANC has such a substantial majority in parliament that it could certainly have included and pulled off, with consultation with MPs that are deployed by the party, some kind of cutback on their part or some kind of symbolic gesture. We have also not heard from Parliament that they're willing to indicate or to implement such a gesture. As for the executive itself, this is really a document that speaks on behalf of the executive. And so there would have been input from all the other ministers, because they would have had to be consulted to account for how they've spent since the last SONA in February and the last budget speech, the full budget speech in February of 2020. So we take all of the ministers' caveats into account, that he can't make that decision. But the fact that he couldn't sway, nor could he be swayed, that this kind of curtailing was coming forth from the executive, tells us something about the growing gap, not just financially, but symbolically, between those who govern South Africa and those who have to eke out a living in it. And that, I think, is a real problem, because the 30 Rand increase of the old age pension, the 10 Rand increase of the child support grant, doesn't even begin to make a dent given the massive increase, almost skyrocketing increase we've seen in food prices, that under 2,000 will be taken home by any kind of old age pensioner, and at last count an ordinary food basket will cost.
Angelo, are you still with us? Okay, we seem to have some difficulty and challenges this week, unfortunately, with the lines. We're going to try and see if we can get Angelo back. We lost him there towards the tail end. He was talking to us about his overall impressions of the budget speech delivered by the finance minister. Okay, Angelo, can you hear me now? Angelo, are you there? Yes. Okay, so the next aspect that I wanted to...
I was suggesting that the growing gap between the governors and the governed, I think, is...
Yeah.
Many increases that are being given to people on the surface, to even be able to afford half of the monthly food basket necessary to survive in this country.
So do they kind of draft the State of the Nation address and the finance minister's budget speech kind of like side by side? Do the two have to kind of fit in somewhat?
So the State of the Nation address and the budget address really come out of the same political process, because the State of the Nation address gives a wider overview of the state of government.
All right. Okay, we seem to have some challenge there with the network, I suppose. Angelo is speaking to us on a cell phone. We had tried Zoom early on. We were not too successful with that. Trying the cell phone now, not very successful with this either. Okay, let's take a quick break. Hopefully, on the other side of this, we'll have a clear line and we'll be able to engage him further in terms of his analysis and assessment of the budget speech 2021. All right, welcome back. Hopefully this time we've got Angelo on the Zoom connection so we can see him and hear him. Let's hope it'll hold. Angelo, can you hear me and see me loud and clear?
I can hear you and see you clearly. Thank you.
All right, so just to wrap up that point you were making when we kind of got cut off, right? You're saying that the State of the Nation address and the budget speech flow from the same political process.
Yes, so the Minister of Finance consults the various other arms of the executive, and as we can tell from the speech, other elements of the larger social compact in South Africa consulted. He talks about the various hints he was given by ordinary South Africans, but he certainly also mentions consulting NEDLAC. There would have been input from the Tripartite Alliance members, including the SACP and the trades union movement. And so this is not just a document that comes out of Tito Mboweni's office or even out of the individual Tito Mboweni's mind. This is a document that reflects larger thinking among the elites of South Africa. And in that sense, it really does speak to the growing gap between the people who govern South Africa and the people who are governed. If we just look at the increases given to people on the social grants, that takes the highest social grant to not even half of what an ordinary food basket per month would cost. And so how those ordinary people are meant to survive during not just an economic crisis, but also a pandemic crisis that further exacerbates the economic crisis in the minds of the people who govern South Africa really is very difficult to see.
What do you make of his response when he was challenged on the issue of the social grants? He said, well, that's what we can afford.
Again, symbolic gestures may have gone some way towards this, because if you measure the gap between the social grants and what the ordinary South Africans have to make do with and what their governors do, the most junior member of parliament earns close to or just over R1 million a year, and that's taxpayers' money. And some symbolic gestures from the executive to take massive salary cuts would have been useful. So even though he can't indicate a reduction in the size of cabinet could have voluntarily taken a massive reduction, because after all, this is a crisis time. If we don't have money, the first place where the cuts should happen should be in the executive. The fact that that hasn't happened to any significant degree is telling. We also need to hear from other members of the three arms and the three tiers of government what kinds of cuts they're willing to make, given that ordinary South Africans are involuntarily being subjected to cuts. It's also important that the minister does begin to, along with his cabinet colleagues, tighten up the regulation of the sectors where ordinary South Africans pay most of their money. The fact that we've had to investigate, after complaints from ordinary people, the massive increases in food prices means that the regulatory authorities in South Africa are reactive rather than proactive. It was entirely foreseeable that in the moment of a crisis, the capitalist enterprises would try and maximize their profit in a downturn of demand by upping the prices. And that is exactly what we've seen. And this ought to have been anticipated, and there should have been an anticipatory regulatory measure put in place, because certainly the kinds of things that we're seeing here is equivalent to war profiteering. As South Africans sink deeper into poverty and insecurity financially, they risk sinking deeper into nutritional insecurity and poverty, and that's certainly not something we can afford, given our longer-term developmental goals as outlined in both SONA and in the budget speech.
The statement that he made, we owe lots of money to lots of people, this has been kind of floating around since the speech. It's made headlines. How do we unpack that? How much of money do we owe to whom? How bad is it? How serious is it?
It is fairly serious, because if we don't have a positive growth outlook, we have no way of finding that money except to go and borrow more to pay off the loans. And that's a debt spiral that we can ill afford to have. And ordinary South Africans certainly understand that debt spiral, because as their income decreased over the crisis of 2020, they had no choice to go and find money elsewhere in often the least, shall we say, charitable sources. By moneylenders and short-term loan operators. And that means that they will now have to make additional loans to pay off the interest on those loans, which puts them into a lifelong, if not an intergenerational debt spiral. And we're not only talking about the middle-class people, we're talking about people at the lower ends of the income scale. So whatever tax breaks they're being given, that's being eaten up by spiraling costs of living. The minister talks about an increase in the fuel levy to fund partly the infrastructure projects. But the problem with that is that ordinary people's commuter costs will go up. Food prices will increase even further. And that means ordinary South Africans, even though they're not getting a tax increase, whether by the increase of the VAT, and they're getting a small tax rebate by way of changing the brackets for income tax generation, those people who don't even fall inside the tax income bracket, the underemployed, unemployed, and the precarious employed, they will continue to pay more of their income in a country where they already spend the majority of their income on transport to and from work and on some kind of food for the family, which means savings are beyond their particular guesswork or possibility at this point. And that, I think, is part of where the mismatch and out of touchness between the administrators and ordinary people, needs to kick in. The gap between what an ordinary teacher earns and what a member of parliament earns has been a really obscene blight on the South African landscape for 20 years. In the moment of a crisis, it is an even bigger blight and a bigger obscenity, and that there seem to be nothing but the same old pat solutions being offered by the Minister of Finance and all his colleagues. This is collective responsibility. None of them have, even in the last year, and it's now been a year since we've had a month from now, it will be the 26th of March, and we will have had a year since those first lockdown regulations and us entering crisis mode. And not a single member of the executive has even suggested in public, never mind the governing party, that there may be a need for a radical downscaling at the symbolic level, because we know it won't make a big dent, between those who govern and those who are governed, that those who govern may have to take the same kind of hit as those who they govern. Because ordinary South Africans have had to give up their income in large amounts, have lost it to a large extent. And while it's admirable to have the kinds of grant systems that were in place for the emergency, and the increases in the social grants are not to be scoffed at, they certainly aren't going to be enough to keep South Africans afloat, given that there are all sorts of other crises knocking at their doors, and saying that government owes is not enough, because the socialization of that huge debt may become the problems of our children and our children's children, and we have to try and avoid that as much as possible.
Now, the issue of the public service and cuts there, he's spoken about cutting in terms of people, positions that are no longer required, retiring people. Many are saying just not enough.
It's not enough, and it may look like a short-term good solution, but we've played this game before, where the most experienced civil servants are the ones who were retired or put on special dispensations in the 1990s. And the consequence of that is a loss of historical memory. And let's not forget that the public service that we are talking about includes teachers and nurses. And so, can we really have a situation where we have even fewer teachers, or we retire our most experienced teachers because they're too costly, or, the same in the medical fraternity? This idea that the public wage bill cut will simply affect people that we think are, counter workers at government offices, is I think a bit of a misunderstanding. That ordinary people work in the public service. The public sector employs people that keep the municipalities, even under the conditions that we currently face, going to some extent. And it's those most experienced people that we can't simply dispense with, because they're the people who stand up when it's corruption time. Those are the people who refuse to put their careers on the line by, like the woman in the VBS scandal, who simply refused to break the Municipal Finance Management Act regulations. Those are experienced members of the public service that we need to value. When there's talk about superfluous hirings, in some of the smaller municipalities and towns, people often wonder, what are these positions? Because we often have towns that have worked without town planners, without town engineers, the consequence of which is breakdown in infrastructure. The very infrastructure and infrastructure management that we're now building will be poorly managed if we don't keep a good public service. And the problem, I think, lies between a bloated public service that is bloated not by skilled people, but bloated precisely by cadre deployment. And this takes us back to SONA, where the president said they want a professional public service. Well, you can't have a professional public service in the municipalities if the municipal employment services are stacked by cadre deployment as an employment measure for party loyalty rewards. And that, I think, is part of what is at odds between government declarations and ANC policy practice, that this actually has to stop. That a decade and a half ago, people like Njabulu Ndebele and Mampile Rampile already indicated the need for a professionalized civil service and public service in South Africa, and to decouple employment in government from loyalty to party. And that cuts across party lines. And the fact that we haven't done it in 15 years means that we now have to undo those 15 years of hires and somehow get the people who have hired, often those underqualified or poorly skilled or party loyal rather than government loyal people, to replace them with people who are going to do the job and who are actually employed. The graduate unemployment rate in South Africa wouldn't be where it is if we didn't have interference of the political kind in employing people at the levels where they need to be employed. PRASA is just one example of what happens when cadre deployment goes wrong. You employ people with fake qualifications, with poor qualifications, in order to protect party interests, but the consequence is that the South African taxpayer ends up billions in debt because of the consequences of the poor decisions made by the underqualified, unqualified, or sometimes fully qualified, but interfered with political decision makers.
The issue of tax, there was a lot of fear going into the speech that taxpayers would be further burdened, directly burdened, to try and secure some revenue in terms of the vaccines. That didn't happen. Was that a surprise? How significant is that?
I think that was a measure that had to do with this being an election year. You cannot hit taxpayers and ordinary people in an election year and with an increase in tax in an already economically constrained environment. There seems to be some incoherence, which we imagine will be resolved once the various other ministers report on how their portfolios are going to cut back tax, or cut back spending in order to save tax. But lowering corporate taxes from 28 to 27%, but curtailing where those taxes and rebates are going to happen is at the moment not yet specified in ways that I think ordinary South Africans will want to hear from. In terms of income tax, the rebates, I think certainly will help very sort of the lowest level of taxpayers to not spend even more of their income in paying for tax. But I think what millions of South Africans who are taxpayers, whether it's VAT or income tax, have been revolting against is the corruption, because that is the waste of tax money. The hundreds of millions, close to $1 billion, that have been lost through PPE scandal, procurement issues, at the municipal level, food parcel disappearances, the UIF corruption scandal, the money wasted in various policing actions, the cost of deploying the SANDF. All of these are tax monies that have to go into paying for these services that are then very poorly delivered. And that means that what little money we have gets spent on these kinds of misfired, shall we say, ventures. And I think what many millions of South Africans are anxious about is seeing even more tax money disappear into the vaccination program and its rollout, because it's not only paying for the vaccines, it's paying for the hundreds of thousands of nurses, doctors, medical personnel who have to administer these, have to safeguard them, have to keep them safe from criminal activity and from corruption. The Zondo Commission and the millions that are pouring into it when they have defiant members of the governing party simply refusing to appear before it. And so the Deputy Chief Justice himself indicating that if people are allowed to get away with this, it would render the entire process and all the money we've poured into it so far moot. The same goes with the criminal justice system having to the various court challenges that ministers can make using taxpayers' money. All of these issues, I think, means that curtailing spending is not just a matter of ordinary South Africans going, oh, it's someone else's money that's being spent. It's our tax money. Every time you buy bubblegum, you pay VAT. Every time ordinary poor people spend their money and pay VAT, they're contributing to coffers. And this idea that this is just a small middle class group and corporate tax is misleading. All of us pay taxes in our activities as economic agents, and it's therefore our money that's being spent in this way. And therefore it is imperative that the executive arm of government begins with its own spending habits, and that includes its own salaries, and begins to think radically differently about the gap, the income gap, the wage gap, the wealth gap between itself and the people that it supposedly represents. There should be no reason for somebody who trains for 4 years to become a school teacher or a nurse to earn a third of what a member of parliament earns for doing what often feels like much less work. This is absolutely obscene in 2021. We're in a crisis. We need much more radical solutions than the ones that have been on offer since the crisis began. They were certainly needed long before that crisis hit, but after the 26th of March 2020, this country, this state, and all 58 million of us need government to take far more radical action on its own that goes not only to the substantial, but also to the symbolic.
The sin taxes, as expected, alcohol, tobacco, the fuel levy, it's an annual kind of discussion. It's a very easy way for government to generate revenue. Nothing you can do about it. It's built into the petrol price. How do we compare to other countries on a similar kind of footing when it comes to the levies that government imposes on the fuel price?
So this takes us back to 2013, when the then head of state and president of the governing party warned members in attendance at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He used the phrase, "We are not like other Africans generally." There seems to be this assumption, which comes up in this budget speech as well, that we have, to quote the minister, a culture of non-payment. Now, this is, I think, a very superficial analysis of the situation. In a country where millions of people actually are not even making enough money to feed themselves and afford a basic way of living, the social net has been crucial to keep them from total penury and to keep the statistics from being more horrific than they already are when it comes to, malnutrition, stunted development, and a variety of other problems that go with making people food insecure. But this idea that there's a culture of non-payment is, I think, to blame ordinary South Africans in ways that allow government to escape with its unaccountability on issues of basic provision of things like housing, better quality schooling and education, better healthcare, and better nutritional provision by making the mechanisms that are supposed to ensure this, that includes the delivery of school meals, regulation of food prices through the Competition Commission, make them work better and more efficiently. And this, I think, is part of the problem here. It's blame shifting, I think, because yes, there are certainly people who don't pay and don't want to pay, but I don't think they make up the vast majority of ordinary South Africans who pay their way every day with what little they can by scraping together. And that, I think, once again, is to elide government's lack of accountability and lack of action, because often these responses are reactive rather than proactive. Let's not forget that this is the same budget speech that happens in a budget here, in which social grant recipients were water cannoned while waiting in line because of an administrative mistake that resulted in grant recipients being taken off a list and then having to be put back on. The coordinated reactions or the coordinated actions of government departments would certainly prevent there from having to be reactions. And so, again, there is substantial work being governed by the executive. There's no denying of that. But some symbolic actions where they show us that they too are willing to be vulnerable in the way that millions of South Africans are forced to be is something that this government needs to work harder at. You can't have a minister cowering behind, in an armored vehicle while ordinary people are being water cannoned. That speaks symbolically to the gap between those who have and those who have not. And in this case, there happen to be the governors and the governed. We saw how poorly that worked out a few years ago when the Minister of Higher Education cowered behind the safety of security officers and a fence in Parliament, while ordinary students were subjected to the security measures that try to keep them at bay from alerting their governors how poorly their government decisions affect them. And that, I think, is part of the problem here, that we're a country in which the gap between the haves and have-nots is increasingly being mirrored between the governed and the governors. And that's not something that is part of the Freedom Charter vision. It's not something that's part of the constitutional vision. It's certainly not something that is part of the anti-apartheid vision for what a post-apartheid South Africa would look like. And there, I think, as a society, we have failed. And here, government certainly has to take its share of the blame in terms of its failure to regulate, its failure to implement and govern pro-poor. And despite the Minister of Finance constantly using the phrase that this is a pro-poor budget, it in many respects isn't, because that fuel levy is going to be an indirect way of taxing the poorest of the poor, because, as we know, with the rail system in the dire state that it's in, they end up having to pay additional costs to transport themselves to precarious jobs, and they pay more for the food that has to be delivered by road freight rather than by rail. And this, I think, is part of that indirect taxing of ordinary South Africans that is often invisibilized by these rhetorical gestures of saying, oh, we're not increasing your VAT, we're not increasing your income tax, but we are increasing the fuel levy, as if that doesn't immediately impact all of the 58 million people who live here.
Vaccine rollout, in terms of what he announced, is it adequate? What's your analysis of how things have been going thus far? We've heard of lengthy queues and healthcare workers having to wait for hours before they could take the jab.
So this is to be expected, because while we have a very good public health system compared to some of the first world countries where public health has been put aside and private healthcare has kicked in, we don't have the kind of public health system that we envisioned in 1994 and that we didn't develop between 1994 and now. And so some of these failures are about having a lack of personnel, having underpaid personnel, and having very poor management structures that our doctors, our nurses, our hospital and clinic administrators have been complaining about for 20 years. So this is not a new problem. We've seen problems like this pop up in the HIV crisis in the Free State, for example, in the TB crisis in KwaZulu-Natal, that when it comes to crisis time, our healthcare system, which is already poorly functioning during ordinary times, if one can call
Okay, we're trying to get Angelo back there. For quite some time, we didn't have a hiccup, and just as we're coming towards the tail end of the interview, we suffer a bit of a challenge there. We will take the final break and hopefully wrap up with Angelo Fick on the other side of this.